it's very difficult to have any true north, right? Most disasters, very difficult to know what's going to happen. I was interested to sit in on the Metropolitan Police Department here in Washington, D.C. has started giving briefings specifically on active shooters to offices and places that are interested. And I was thinking to myself, what are they gonna say? Like, this is a tough one, you know? But it's very impressive, actually, that they're dealing with this head on. And they gave a presentation which basically said, you know, the kind of buzzwords that you hear, which are run, hide, fight for a active shooter. But they explained specifically what that might look like and gave people a sense of agency. And then, you know, the more you kind of have a sense of what you can do, the less likely it is that fear will shut down your response, right? There's like a zone with fear, and a little is good. Too much, you begin to really have cognitive and physical decline, right? So in that case, they were able to come up with very specific things that to this day I think about, you know, like grab a fire extinguisher, you know. There are things in your office that you can use. You don't want to think about this stuff, right? But it is much better than thinking about yourself as just a helpless victim, even if you are, right? So there is value in giving people a sense of agency, in reminding them of the value in running and hiding before fighting, but that at some point they may have to fight and not to expect someone to come save them. And that was the message the police were sending. And it's distressing that we're at that point, but it's better to give people a sense of options and their own power, such as it is, than to not talk about it. On average, people in the World Trade Center waited 6 minutes before beginning their evacuation. There were lots of good reasons for that, but some people waited much, much longer. Some people got misinformation from the Port Authority telling them to stay. So it's always really tricky. We know that people who have experience with past disasters, anecdotally, also people who have military experience, again, anecdotally, in my interviews, those people tended to react more quickly because they had something to work with and they had a sense of their own role, the way that they could influence events. They knew intrinsically in their bones that things could go very badly very quickly. Knowing that can be a burden, but it can also empower you to take action and push through that phase. We mentioned Scully earlier, the pilot who landed the commercial airplane in the Hudson River. Do you remember this in Manhattan? And even who's a very experienced pilot, he said in his first interview with Katie Couric, he said, you know, when those engines went out, my first thought was, this can't be happening. You know, I had it in my head that I would not one day land a commercial airplane in the water. So even he has this moment, and most emergency responders, soldiers, everybody goes through this phase. If you know to expect it, you can kind of push. You can actually recognize yourself going through it and push faster. The things that also influence are the people around you, right? So if people scream at you to get out, then you're more likely to kind of snap out of that stupor. So I went to some flight attendant training for this research, and they are now trained in the best of cases to yell at passengers, not to, because what will happen is most plane crashes are survivable and they end up on the ground, the plane's on fire, you need to get off very quickly, the smoke's very toxic. So the whole game is moving through that denial phase really quickly, right? But you have no experience for this, right? Like you got nothing. So what happens is people immediately, even when the cabin is filled with smoke and something terrifying has just happened, people will go for their overhead bags, right? And that's because that's what we always do when we get off the plane. So they've trained flight attendants to scream at you not to do that, to leave your bags, to go, 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 and that does help. A lot of first responders do this as well. They will use very direct language in very intense situations, and it's not because they're really angry. It's because that helps break through this kind of lethargy. But there are many, many stories of individuals grabbing the hand of the person next to them and saying, we're going, we're getting out of here. And that breaks through the stupor. So again, really depends on the people you're with and the training and wisdom they all have combined. The survivors I talk to, I very explicitly talk to survivors who have already talked to the media. I don't like to re-traumatize people who aren't ready or interested in talking. So I'm kind of self-selecting for survivors who have maybe processed this in a certain way and are more either able or interested in kind of moving to try to help others. But so I can't speak to all survivors, but the ones that I did talk to, yes, definitely. They very much want to share these stories. They often will reach out to survivors of very different new disasters as they come because they can really feel a connection to that. In the case of Christian, when he was back in Thailand, he ended up leaving his life in Singapore, working on this, building this charity. And one night he was driving home late, and it was maybe a year after the tsunami, and it was, dark rural roads, and a bus had tumbled into a ravine in an accident. And all these cars had pulled over, and people were just sort of staring, and there were 40 people on this bus. Almost half of them had died instantly, but there were a lot of survivors. And in this case, because of his experience, Christian immediately pushed through that phase of just staring and wondering and trying to make sense of it. And he started yelling at people to help the survivors. And he got as many survivors as he could into his vehicle and other people's vehicles, and they had to drive 45 minutes to the nearest hospital. But there was this one moment, and he describes it as one of the few moments where he really felt some peace since the tsunami, when he looked in his rearview mirror and he saw a convoy of cars behind him because they were following him. And this is what we know. People will become unbelievably compliant and obedient and courteous in a disaster. So if there is a vocal, wise leader, they will follow.